March 1969. Somewhere east of Hanoi, beneath layered camouflage netting and hastily poured concrete, an aircraft rested inside a reinforced hangar that was never meant to hold it. Its silhouette was wrong for the region. Too wide, too heavy, too deliberate. This machine had not been designed for jungle airstrips or short, violent interceptions. It was an American F-4 Phantom II, or what remained of one. Officially, the aircraft no longer existed. In U.S. records, it had vanished over the Gulf of Tonkin after a probable systems failure. Another disappearance folded quietly into a war defined by numbers too large to feel human. Unofficially, it had survived long enough to become something far more dangerous than a wreck. The pilot had not been so fortunate. The Phantom had limped south on one engine, trailing smoke, hydraulics failing, flight controls degrading with every second. Somehow, by a combination of skill and stubborn physics, it reached land. Anti-aircraft fire finished the equation before capture became an option. The jet slammed into a compacted dirt strip used by North Vietnamese logistics units, tearing its landing gear apart, but leaving the fuselage largely intact. Within minutes, soldiers surrounded it. None of them had ever seen an American aircraft this closely. Up close, it felt less like a weapon and more like infrastructure. Thick skin panels, precision rivets, access hatches everywhere, each promising complexity beneath. Word traveled upward quickly. This was not scrap. This was intelligence. Engineers arrived within hours. Electronics were disconnected, stabilized, cataloged. Anything that could be removed without destroying context was removed. Anything unfamiliar was documented by hand. English labels were copied carefully into notebooks. By nightfall, a decision had already been made through channels that never appeared in writing. This aircraft would not stay in Vietnam. The Phantom was dismantled in sections and moved north under darkness. Trucks avoided roads, then trains avoided schedules, then trucks again avoided names. The men escorting it were not told the destination, only the importance. By late April, it crossed into China. By May, it reached a Soviet airfield whose designation had been scrubbed from public maps years earlier. When the hangar doors closed behind it, the aircraft entered a world that would never acknowledge its presence. Colonel Viktor Andreev stood beneath the fuselage and said nothing for a long time. He had spent his career around Soviet aircraft, lean, aggressive, brutally honest machines that revealed their intentions at a glance. This was something else. The Phantom felt architectural, as if it had been designed by committees rather than instincts. Americans, he finally said, build aircraft the way they build cities. Inspection took weeks. Every panel revealed another layer of wiring. Redundancy stacked on redundancy. Specialized modules that could not be replaced without precise documentation. Soviet technicians, accustomed to aircraft that could be serviced in the field with basic tools, moved carefully, almost cautiously. The cockpit alone became a subject of debate. Warning lights everywhere. Color-coded systems. Instruments designed not just to inform, but to guide, correct, and intervene. The aircraft did not trust its pilot. It anticipated error and worked continuously to prevent it. That realization unsettled Andreev more than any performance figure. Authorization from Moscow arrived in June. Limited testing. Absolute secrecy. No photography beyond documentation. A test pilot was assigned, Major Alexei Morozov. He was chosen not for ideology, but for survivability. Morozov had flown unstable prototypes and landed aircraft others would have abandoned. When he first climbed into the Phantom's cockpit, he took his time. This machine, he said over the intercom, assumes I will fail. Andreev asked if that troubled him. No, Morozov replied. It explains everything. The first engine start echoed through the hangar like distant thunder. The sound was heavy, controlled, disciplined. Instruments came alive across the cockpit, lights flickering and resolving as systems synchronized. Everything reported, everything monitored. Taxi tests revealed the same personality. The Phantom did not lunge. It rolled deliberately, obediently. Takeoff required more runway than Soviet fighters, but once airborne, the aircraft climbed smoothly, without urgency or drama. In the air, Morozov tested the controls. The Phantom did not snap into turns. It resisted sudden inputs, dampening movement, smoothing aggression. Where a MiG demanded precision and punished hesitation, this aircraft forgave. It corrected. It intervened. Acceleration was respectable, but not sharp. Climb rate acceptable, turning performance inferior to a MiG-21. And yet, something else became clear. This aircraft, Morozov reported, allows an average pilot to remain effective. Andreev understood the implication immediately. The Phantom was not designed for individual brilliance. It was designed for systems, radar operators, missile envelopes, engagements decided beyond visual range. The pilot was not the centerpiece. He was a component. This aircraft was built to prevent chaos from ever reaching the cockpit. The landing was uneventful. The Phantom absorbed minor errors without protest, settling onto the runway with mechanical patience. When the engines shut down, silence filled the hangar. Morozov removed his helmet and looked back at the aircraft. "It is impressive," he said carefully, "but it belongs to a world where logistics never fail, bases are secure, and systems remain intact." He paused. "In war," he added, "those assumptions die first." And for the first time since the aircraft arrived, Andreev felt certain that what they had captured was not merely an enemy machine, but a window into how the Americans believed wars were supposed to be fought. The second phase of testing began quietly, without ceremony or announcement. By July 1969, the Phantom had been fully reassembled, its American avionics partially restored using salvaged components and improvised Soviet test equipment. It was not combat-ready, but it didn't need to be. What Moscow wanted now was not performance, but understanding. They flew it again and again. High-altitude profiles, low-speed handling, simulated combat maneuvers against theoretical MiG opponents. Every flight was recorded, transcribed, dissected. Engineers argued late into the night over tables cluttered with schematics and cigarette ash. The aircraft provoked fascination and discomfort in equal measure. What unsettled them most was not what the Phantom could do, but what it assumed. It assumed long runways. It assumed constant radar coverage. It assumed fuel, spare parts, trained crews, and time. In one test, Morozov deliberately flew the aircraft as if under combat stress. Aggressive inputs, rapid system changes, simulated damage. The Phantom responded by stabilizing him, filtering his mistakes, preventing departure from controlled flight. Any Soviet aircraft would have punished him for the same behavior. After landing, Morozov summarized it bluntly. "This aircraft protects its pilot from himself." That sentence traveled quickly. A report was compiled and sent to Moscow under restricted classification. It avoided emotional language. Soviet doctrine did not reward it. Still, between the lines, the message was clear. American engineering sought to replace human limitation with technology. Soviet engineering sought to work around it. A week later, a delegation arrived from Moscow. Designers, doctrine officers, one man from the general staff who asked few questions and listened carefully. They stood in the hangar, staring at the Phantom like surgeons examining a foreign organ. One of the designers finally spoke. "They built a machine for a perfect war." Andreev nodded. "And we built machines for broken ones." Further testing focused on maintainability. The Phantom fared poorly. Components required specialized tools. Access panels were logical but numerous. Replacing certain modules took hours where a MiG required minutes. The aircraft's brilliance came at the cost of fragility. Damage tolerance was acceptable, but recovery was not simple. In Vietnam, that difference mattered. Intelligence summaries from Hanoi began to align with the test data. American aircraft dominated beyond visual range, but when engagements collapsed into chaos, when missiles missed and formations broke, the Phantom's advantages narrowed. Its pilots survived longer, yes, but the aircraft itself demanded an ecosystem that war rarely preserved. One engineer wrote a note in the margin of a draft report. "Complexity survives peace. Simplicity survives war." By August, the conclusion was unavoidable. The Phantom was not inferior. It was dangerous in the context it was designed for, but it was vulnerable to attrition, logistics disruption, and prolonged conflict. It was a weapon of control, not endurance. Morozov flew the aircraft one last time before testing ended. At altitude, he leveled off and allowed the machine to fly itself for a moment, hands light on the controls. The Phantom was stable, obedient, confident. It felt like a promise. On the ground, he said something that never appeared in any report. "If we built this," he said, "we would lose pilots slower." Andreev replied quietly. And war's faster. Morozov didn't answer. By September, the decision was made. The aircraft would not be publicly studied. Its lessons were too philosophical, too inconvenient. Some data would be forwarded to design bureaus. Most would be archived. The Phantom would be disassembled again, stored, eventually forgotten. But the ideas did not disappear. Within a few years, Soviet aircraft designs began to show subtle changes. Improved ergonomics, better pilot aids, not to replace the pilot, but to extend him. Quiet acknowledgments that the Americans had understood something real, even if they had built it too expensively. The Phantom never flew again after 1969. Officially, it never existed. But among the men who touched it, who flew it, who argued over it in smoke-filled rooms, it left behind a quiet, unsettling truth. The enemy was not foolish, not wasteful, not blind. He was fighting a different kind of war, one that assumed order could be engineered into chaos. Vietnam proved otherwise. And somewhere in a sealed hangar, beneath dust and silence, the American aircraft waited, a monument to a war that no machine, no matter how advanced, could ever fully control. The Phantom's final chapter unfolded without witnesses. By early 1970, the hangar that once buzzed with engineers and translators had fallen silent. The aircraft was disassembled with care bordering on respect. Major components were tagged, cataloged, and sealed away in crates marked only with numbers. No red stars. No American insignia. Nothing that acknowledged what it had been. Officially, the evaluation program ended with no remarkable conclusions. Unofficially, it changed how certain people thought about air war forever. Colonel Andreev was tasked with writing the closing assessment. It was not meant for publication, not even for wide circulation. A single copy went to the general staff. Another disappeared into an archive whose location Andreev himself was not told. He chose his words carefully, aware that conclusions, not data, were the most dangerous part of any report. He wrote that the American aircraft represented a doctrine of control, a belief that technology could compress uncertainty, reduce chaos, and keep war within manageable parameters. The Phantom was not built to improvise. It was built to dominate a structured battle space. Soviet aircraft, by contrast, assumed disorder as the default condition. They expected damaged runways, incomplete information, exhausted pilots, and mechanics working in the open. Where the Phantom sought to insulate its crew from reality, Soviet designs forced the crew to adapt to it. Neither approach was wrong, but they were incompatible. Andreev noted that in short, controlled conflicts, the American philosophy would likely prevail decisively. Precision, coordination, and systems integration offered overwhelming advantage. In long wars, however, where infrastructure eroded and assumptions collapsed, complexity became a liability. He ended the report with a sentence that almost didn't make it past internal review. Technology does not eliminate chaos. It only postpones it. The Phantom's components were distributed quietly. Some went to design bureaus for study. Others vanished into storage. A few instruments appeared years later in test labs, stripped of context, their origins unspoken. Morozov transferred to another unit and never flew a foreign aircraft again. When asked once, years later, what he thought of American engineering, he paused before answering. "They build machines that care about their pilots," he said. "We build machines that assume the pilot must care for himself." After Vietnam ended, the Phantom faded from Soviet attention. New threats emerged. New aircraft took priority. But the lessons lingered, surfacing subtly in design discussions, in debates over pilot workload, in arguments about how much automation was too much. In the late 1970s, Andreev visited an aviation museum in Moscow. He walked past rows of MiGs, Sukhois, and prototypes that never flew. He stopped in front of a display labeled simply "Foreign Aircraft Components." Behind the glass sat an American altimeter and part of a radar interface, anonymous to everyone else. To him, they were echoes. He thought of the jungle airstrip near Hanoi, of the aircraft that had crossed borders and ideologies without permission. He thought of how both sides had misunderstood each other, assuming stupidity where there was simply a different answer to the same problem. War, he had learned, was not decided by who built the better machine. It was decided by whose assumptions survived contact with reality. The Phantom had been a product of confidence. confidence in systems, logistics, and control. The MiG had been a product of doubt that any of those would remain intact when they were needed most. Neither philosophy had won Vietnam, but both had been exposed by it. Years later, long after files were declassified and names forgotten, a junior analyst stumbled across Andreev's report in a restricted archive. The language felt old, cautious, restrained, but the conclusion felt uncomfortably modern. He copied one line into his notebook before returning the file. In war, endurance is not built from perfection, but from forgiveness. The American aircraft never flew again. Its metal aged in silence. But its ideas moved on, crossing borders more quietly than any plane ever could, shaping designs, doctrines, and doubts on both sides of a divided world. And that, perhaps, was its most lasting mission.